Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for the Healing Advocacy Fund campaign debrief and next steps for Measure 109. We're going to go ahead and give folks maybe another couple of minutes to pour in here. There's a lot of interest in this webinar, and so we're just going to give folks a couple more minutes to get situated. As you can see, I've got a poll up. Just curious where folks are hailing from, whether it be Oregon, another US state, or another country. Really glad to see so many familiar names and so many new ones as well. Feel free to drop a hello and where you're hailing from in the chat box as well. And again, we'll get started in about 3 minutes here. Thanks again for joining us. Stay tuned. I know lots of folks here from Oregon, folks. Hey, Daniel out there from New York. Good to see you. Thanks for joining. And feel free if you are with an organization or anything of that nature that you'd like to share, the chat box is yours. Obviously, this is a webinar, so it's a little bit of a one-way street, which isn't typically the format we use here. But this is a community, global community at this point, it feels for sure. And feel free to share any other information about you or your organization or what you're working on in the chat box. Again, feel free to add your questions in the Q&A function. I would encourage you to hold off until towards the end of the presentation. Typically, I do answer about 75% of the questions throughout this presentation, but of course, I'm sure there'll be additional questions at the end, and I've reserved an ample amount of time to answer as many of those questions as possible. So we'll go ahead and give folks about another minute, and then I'll kick us off and we'll dive right in. Thanks for joining us. We'll start shortly. Alrighty, well, we're gonna go ahead and get started here. And for those curious who all is in the room, primarily folks from Oregon, definitely a handful of folks from other states, no one else from other countries yet. I'm sure there's folks around the world that are super interested. We will be posting a recorded version of this at some point later this week. It's all me these days with the Healing Advocacy Fund. So do give me a little bit of time to get this uploaded, but I promise to get it up hopefully by the end of this week, if not at the end of next week. So really quickly, a couple of things that I wanted to do in terms of introduction. Again, my name is Sam Chapman. I use he, him, his pronouns. I was the campaign manager for Measure 109 here in Oregon. For those of you who also know what that is already, the psilocybin therapy initiative and measure in Oregon that created the first ever program at the state level for psilocybin therapy for anyone who stands to benefit from having access. And so there's just a couple things I wanted to say before we get started here. First and foremost, thank you to so many of you. I recognize so many names here for helping make Measure 109 a reality. Tom and Shree Eckert, the chief petitioners, have been working on this for 5 years. And so this has been a long time coming, and it really took a community to make this happen. It took the entire community to make this happen, from folks very, very early on talking within their own communities and helping collect signatures during a pandemic nonetheless. And we made history so many different times throughout this campaign last year, and I would not be here today. We would not have done this without your help. And that's people inside and outside of Oregon, again, collecting signatures, donating, making phone calls, sending text messages. From the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for all of that effort that you put forth. It certainly took a village, and a village is what we threw at it. I also want to take a moment for Cherie Eckert. For those of you who may not already be aware, Cherie unfortunately and unexpectedly passed away a few days before Christmas. And Cherie she held so much space for so many people in this community and was such a forefront leader in the psychedelic space. And we certainly wouldn't be here if it weren't for all of the contributions that she made throughout her life, and more recently over the last few years, specifically within the psychedelic space. I would like to take a moment, if you knew Cherie or had witnessed any of the amazing acts of kindness and generosity that she has given to this world, and you'd like to say something about Cherie in the comments, please take a moment. She was absolutely a psychedelic leader, and again, we wouldn't be here if it were not for Cherie and Tom's leadership here in Oregon that has really set the tone for psilocybin therapy and access to psilocybin therapy for many years and decades to come. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank Cherie and have a quick moment of silence for her. Okay, well, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Again, feel free to ask any questions you have in the Q&A function. I would encourage you to wait towards the end of the event to ask your questions. There's a good chance that I will probably answer your question, but I'm sure there's a host of questions that I may not get to in this presentation. And so I've reserved a good 30 minutes or so at the end of this presentation for, I need to share my sound, for folks to ask their questions. I'll be sure to answer as many of them as I possibly can. Give me 1 second, I'll share my screen here. Okay, so first and foremost, a little bit about the Healing Advocacy Fund. The Healing Advocacy Fund's mission is fairly straightforward. Protect the intent and the spirit of Measure 109 as passed by Oregon voters to ensure that psilocybin therapy is affordable, accessible, and equitable for all who stand to benefit, while keeping patient safety and facilitator training top of mind. We're going to dive a lot more into exactly what that means and how we can accomplish those things here in Oregon in a few slides to come. So a little bit of a Measure 109 recap for those of you who have attended an event anytime during the campaign. Some of this is going to be a refresher for you. For others, this may be totally new. It's all really important information for folks to know. So we're just going to go ahead and dive in on a little summary recap of what Measure 109 actually does. So many of you might remember this quick 2-minute animation. Again, shout out to our friends at MindMed Australia for allowing us to repurpose this video for Oregon's campaign. And I'll go ahead and allow this 2-minute short video to play. That should give you a really good foundational sense as to what Measure 109 does. Can people hear that?
Almost all of us in Oregon have a friend or neighbor who struggles with mental health challenges. These are everyday problems, even before the pandemic and recession. Depression, anxiety, addiction. Too many Oregonians have spent years moving from medication to medication and doctor to doctor with little relief for feelings of severe depression or anxiety. We need other options. Those other options may soon be available. There's new research being conducted on therapy using psilocybin, a plant medicine. It's being studied for mental health benefits now at New York University, Johns Hopkins University, UCLA. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration found that it's a, quote, breakthrough therapy, giving a green light to path-breaking research. Psilocybin therapy would be regulated, permitted only in licensed offices, and not legalized for recreational use. There would be a controlled framework with strict safeguards in place. It takes place with a licensed and trained facilitator after a thorough evaluation and screening process. In a preparation session in the days before, you discuss the details of the day and what to expect from the session itself. On the day of the treatment, the client takes the psilocybin and experiences the effects, always with guidance and supervision. After the session ends, in an integration session in the days after, The client returns to discuss the experience, interpret what happened, and how to put it to good use in the future. Pioneering research studies show psilocybin therapy may help people break troublesome mental patterns and find new ways to cope with past traumas and difficulties. And it helps them do so without resorting to high daily doses of pharmaceuticals with all kinds of side effects. People are living happier lives. It's a new approach, worth considering.
Alrighty. So a little bit of a verbal recap here. Again, Measure 109 and what it does. First and foremost, it establishes a regulatory framework within the Oregon Health Authority, that will be the licensing authority, that will allow trained practitioners to administer psilocybin services at specially licensed centers. Another pivotal point of Measure 109, it establishes an Oregon Psilocybin Advisory Board, which will be appointed by the governor. We're going to talk a lot more about the advisory board in a couple of slides to come here. Also incredibly important, Measure 109 imposes a 2-year development period before the initial licenses are granted. Again, we have many slides and we will dive in deeper in a few slides to come on that. Measure 109 also requires the establishment of training and licensure system for psilocybin facilitators, manufacturers, and testing labs, and requires the establishment of a tracking system for psilocybin products as well. Just as importantly as what Measure 109 does do, here are some of the things that Measure 109 does not do. There are no retail sales of psilocybin allowed under Measure 109. There will be no off-site consumption, possession, or cultivation of psilocybin under Measure 109. There will be no branding or advertising of psilocybin products under Measure 109. Now, to anticipate one of the very common questions that comes right after this, yes, services will be allowed to be advertised. However, it will be within the purview of the Oregon Health Authority to determine exactly how those services can or cannot be advertised. Moving on, there will be no unregulated or untracked psilocybin production, delivery, or inventory. Psilocybin therapy centers will not be allowed within 1,000 feet of schools, and there will be no access available to minors. Moving forward, this is the general 3-step process in the psilocybin services modality, one that is probably very familiar to many of you who are familiar to this space in general. The first is the preparation session. This is where a facilitator will meet with a client to really help better understand not only their health background, but to ensure that they are ready to move forward with the psilocybin therapy experience. We know that the importance of the relationship between a facilitator and the client is incredibly important in creating the environment of safety and helping them really understand the experience that it is that they are about to embark on. And so on top of that, that preparation session also acts as a mental health review to ensure that the patient or the client is able to safely benefit from accessing psilocybin therapy. The second step is the psilocybin therapy session itself. Again, this must occur at a psilocybin service center. The facilitator must be present throughout the entire process, and the facilitator must certify the completion of the session itself. And last, but certainly not least, is the integration session that must be offered by a facilitator after completion of the psilocybin session itself. And moving on. And just a quick note, I am not able to completely keep up with the chat. I'm the only one doing admin here, so bear with me. If you are typing things in the chat, I'm not going to be able to get to those towards the end. Again, if you do have questions about things that we talked about, feel free to drop them in the question and answer, and I will get to them at the end of this webinar. So moving forward into campaign strategy and recap. Education was the name of the game here in Oregon. What you're looking at here are some numbers. And in fact, we've got a lot of really cool stats, some of which are going to be very new even to the folks who were on the campaign. This is where people were at when we read them just the ballot title. So the ballot title is what shows up on your voter's ballot. That is a very short synopsis of what the measure does. It's not necessarily a full, complete explanation. It's kind of bits and pieces in a very boiled down format. And so when we just read, folks, the ballot language, and this is very early on in the campaign, about 45% of people that we polled supported the measure just on the ballot measure title itself. Not a ton. Now, after we were able to educate people on what the measure does, we got up to 54%. And that was very early on in the campaign. We've got some additional stats that I want to share with you as well. So again, educating to win. These were the 4.5, 5 primary points in which we found out if we were able to convey what psilocybin was, what the current research says, what Measure 109 does, and sometimes more importantly, depending on the audience, what Measure 109 does not do. And last but certainly not least, who stands to benefit from having access to psilocybin therapy? With this combination of information, in a fairly short amount of time, we were able to educate the average Oregon voter in a way that not only allowed us to win, but it allowed us to win in a pretty big fashion. So as you can see here, here's a little bit of a timeline in terms of our polls and where we started. Early October, again, here's some of those numbers that you saw. In August 2020, that's when we really started to initiate a lot of our messaging publicly with the campaign. We were neck and neck, 41% yes, 41% no, a whole lot of undecided folks. And as you can see, as time went on, as we continued to do our ad placements and really start getting things off the ground and talking a lot more publicly with our education, providing information to the exact questions that I just mentioned, we started to see a very big uptick in support. And we started to see undecideds go down. This is a very, very important aspect. And here are some of the main factors of what drove yes votes. So in post-election polling, voters cited research and the potential for mental health treatments as the strongest motivators for their support. Right behind the ability to potentially help folks that are struggling with mental health conditions, depression and anxiety was huge, right? Especially within the pandemic. One of the common lines that we use, that we still use today, is, you know, at the end of the day, we all know someone who is suffering from depression or anxiety, if not ourselves. And so, the idea wasn't to convince people this is for you, right? The idea was to help people understand that this could be for someone that they love, right? And really being able to provide the science and the research in combination with the emotional appeal of being able to provide new tools to the tool belt in combating mental health illness was really a strong case when put in combination, really made folks feel comfortable about moving forward with Measure 109 in general. So here is a quick video that is a 30-second advertisement that we did on TV that highlights some of the primary facts and ways in which we package this information up for Oregon voters. If you are in a different state and you are interested in what picture perfect messaging looks like, you might want to take some notes on this one. This can also be found on the Healing Advocacy Fund YouTube page as well.
Measure 109 regulates a promising approach for depression and anxiety, psilocybin therapy, a medicine derived from mushrooms with access controlled. Measure 109's regulations require psilocybin only be used by adults in licensed clinics supervised by trained facilitators. It's not legal for recreation, it's not sold in stores. A 2-year phase-in to develop safety, practice, and training standards. Measure 109 promotes safety for a therapy that can help people who are suffering.
So again, 30 seconds, a ton of information in a very concise format. Again, I'd encourage you, if you are from another state and you're interested in messaging, check out our YouTube page. If someone would be so kind as to maybe drop that link, that would be great, but I'm sure it won't be hard to find. You can look up Yes on 109 Oregon, and I'm sure our videos will pop up. A couple of additional stats here before we move into implementation and rulemaking, which I'm sure is going to be the bulk of the interest for attendees here. Process and education. Again, when we really started out, no one really knew what psilocybin was. That was our biggest challenge and our biggest opportunity to really start from scratch with the average Oregon voter and helping them understand what psilocybin was. So again, when we did start, oh wow, there we go. Sorry about that. When we started in October, again, folks that were familiar with the substance of psilocybin, 37%, not a ton of people, especially if you're within this community. You might think more people are aware of this than actually are. And it turns out very few people knew what psilocybin was, or if they did, they still weren't entirely sure what it was either. Post-election, we went from 37% to 63%. That's a 26% bump. That's all the education this campaign was able to do. We saw similar bumps in terms of being able to help treat mental health conditions. We saw similar bumps in terms of psilocybin as the subject of serious scientific research. and that Measure 109 has safety built into the measure and top of mind in terms of ensuring that patients' safety is a top priority, as well as facilitator training. So here's, mine keeps bouncing around here. Here's one final 30-second ad that really hones in on the promise that psilocybin therapy has for folks that are dealing with a terminal illness.
I've worked in end-of-life care for 28 years. In hospice, we believe when people are dying, we should treat their pain, physical or mental distress. There's often mental suffering that comes with a terminal diagnosis, so I support Measure 109 to allow psilocybin therapy for terminally ill people suffering from depression. It's humane. Yes on 109 will help those near death come to terms with their diagnosis and find peace.
Again, just another really good example of a powerful emotional narrative that at the end of the day is very hard to argue against. Here in Oregon, we have a death with dignity law, and so that makes this type of narrative even more powerful. But in general, it's pretty hard to argue against folks that have been given a terminal diagnosis that want to try new options. They should be able to do so, and under Measure 109, they will be able to do so. All right, so last, this is a little fun county by county breakdown that I pulled and really started to look at the vote percentages for each county. Obviously, this is not per city, but I think this is really interesting and really goes to show how psilocybin therapy, I personally believe, is starting to buck the partisan trend that we've seen in a lot of other political areas in general. But again, during our signature collection phase, I think we collected signatures from people in over 300 different Oregon cities. To be honest, I had no idea that there were 300 cities in Oregon. Turns out there are, and turns out there is at least one person in every single county that is in favor of this. And so even though that not a majority, there's a lot of pockets here that you may not necessarily think, would have supported Measure 109, but they did. And again, I think we've got a lot of counties here that we can start looking towards being able to provide these services in the tail end of this 2-year time frame. And hopefully we're going to have even more counties and cities involved here as time moves forward, as we continue to educate decision makers, regulators, and policymakers over the next 2 years. Again, our education is not done. If you did any kind of work on the campaign, none of this is new to you. We still have so much education to do to ensure that Measure 109 is the most affordable, accessible, and equitable psilocybin therapy program possible. It is all eyes on Oregon for the next 2 years, and we don't need to look much further behind us than cannabis to see whatever state moves first, whether it's a good model or a bad model, stands to be replicated. And so that's exactly why we take our responsibility here in Oregon so seriously, is to ensure that not only what we're doing here in Oregon is affordable and accessible and equitable for Oregonians, but to ensure that to whatever degree this model is replicated in other states and countries to come, it's just as affordable and equitable for them as well. Okay, implementation, cruising right along here. So, as I just mentioned, literally these, in my mind, are the 3 keys to a successful implementation. Number 1, affordability. This should not be a surprise to anyone out there, right? And it's not lost on myself or anyone who worked on the campaign or anyone who's going to be working on rulemaking moving forward, that talking about making sure that psilocybin therapy is affordable is easier said than done. It is not lost on me, and I'm certainly going to make sure it's not lost on regulators that when we're talking about creating affordable access to psilocybin therapy within the larger context of the healthcare insurance world, which often is not affordable, accessible, or equitable for a ton of people, we have a lot of really good, hard work to do to find ways in which we can work with all of our community stakeholders, right? Where we can center our BIPOC individuals and communities and help, drive the conversation around what affordable access really looks like for them, right? And ensuring that those same BIPOC individuals and communities are involved in creating equitable rules, regulations, services, and licensing, and that they are also compensated for the work that they do. I think it's one of the big things that, again, we don't have to look too far behind us to see all of the missed opportunities in cannabis that we had from an equitable licensing and access standpoint, that we have a window in time right now to get this right here in Oregon. And that is going to be my primary focus. That is going to be a primary focus of the Healing Advocacy Fund, is to ensure that this program is affordable, accessible, and equitable for all that stand to benefit. If we can't do that, frankly, this all was for nothing. And so we've got our work cut out. We're just getting started. The dust has settled on the campaign, but we're moving into the second chapter now. And this is really what is going to make or break the future of this program. And so I would encourage all of you that if you are interested in helping put forward the best program possible, to continue to stay involved and continue to educate yourself in ways in which you can be of service to the rulemaking period, whether it be sharing experiences or being involved in the process or working with other nonprofits. There's going to be a lot of new fun ways to get involved with this over the next 2 years. Definitely stay tuned in. There's going to be a lot more to come on this front. So moving right into the Psilocybin Advisory Board. Actually, I think it'd be fun. I don't have a poll for this, but if you've applied to be on the Psilocybin Advisory Board and you feel comfortable sharing that, please go ahead and say so in the chat box. I think it'd be cool for folks to identify themselves, even if you don't get appointed to the board. You probably clearly have some type of expertise that's worth sharing with the community in general. And I think even though folks there's only going to be 14 to 16 members on this regular board, there's so many qualified candidates out there, many of which are probably on this webinar right now. I very much encourage as many of you to connect as possible. We've got a lot of good hard work cut out for us over the next 2 years. So to the Psilocybin Advisory Board and the duties. So one of the first homework assignments once the Psilocybin Advisory Board is announced is for the board to collect all existing studies on psilocybin research to date and make them publicly available. This is really to ensure that Psilocybin Advisory Board, along with the Oregon Health Authority, all starts from the same foundational point of what does the science show, what do we know right now, and how can we utilize that to move forward in creating the best program possible here in Oregon. Other duties include recommending guidelines for serving clients and licensed facilitators and service centers, establishing public safety standards, establishing professional conduct, certification, and training requirements. The most common question I probably get is, what is it going to take to be a psilocybin facilitator? Great question. That is a big, huge question that is going to be tackled within the next 2 years of rulemaking. There's going to be a whole host of conversations around what is the proper and adequate amount of training and certification that facilitators need to have. As I said during the campaign, it is still true today. Just because you've been an ER doctor at OHSU for 30 years does not necessarily mean that you have a decent understanding of psilocybin or how it works. And conversely, just because you've been doing really good work within your own communities with psilocybin therapy does not necessarily mean you have the training to be able to provide those services professionally and publicly within a regulated scheme. And so there's room for everyone to participate in this program. And what Measure 109 really does is it creates a therapeutic path for everyone to be involved to some extent. And again, the next 2 years of rulemaking is going to be incredibly important to ensure that people from both ends of the spectrum are able to participate in a way that is equitable and affordable and accessible, both in a licensing perspective, as well as accessing the services in general. Additional duties are developing a long-term strategic plan for ensuring, again, that psilocybin services will be accessible and affordable. This is not just my priority. This is the priority of the Oregon Health Authority. It's the priority of the governor's office. It's the priority of everyone involved, or at least it needs to be the priority of everyone involved. And I'm certain that the advisory board will hold these priorities in a similar fashion, just as we do. And of course, monitoring and studying federal law. And I do expect at some point there will be subcommittees established underneath the board. More details on that to come. Again, the board members haven't been announced yet. That's going to happen sometime between now and February 28th. So stay tuned. I'm sure that the announcement of that board will be news, so you won't have to look too much further to be able to hear about who all got appointed to that Psilocybin Advisory Board. So again, these are for those of you who are less familiar with that process or maybe that didn't apply. There are a lot of seats that the Oregon Health Authority is looking to fill. And I can tell you in general that there's been a lot of interest in the Psilocybin Advisory Board. In fact, this broke all records for any previous Oregon governor-appointed commission and committee. They received over 250 applications, which is, again, a historic amount of applications and interest for a program like this. I'm personally not entirely surprised. Oregon residents are being given preference, but that does not mean that outside, if you're outside the state of Oregon, that you couldn't apply. The application period is now over. They are now in the process of reviewing those applications and are starting to move into an interview phase. But again, from the folks that I've talked to, there is a large and diverse number of qualified candidates, and I'm incredibly excited for the governor's office and the Oregon Health Authority to announce who's on that Psilocybin Advisory Board so we can get to work, because we certainly have a lot to do. All right, and last but certainly not least is the implementation timeline. Again, where we're at right here is in between the governor making the appointment to the advisory board and the advisory board's first meeting. Again, we've got a lot of compilation of research to do, and then essentially all of 2021 into 2022 is going to be rulemaking. Again, we have so much to dive into, from talking about equitable licensing, to exploring what mechanisms group therapy could exist in, to ensuring that rural Oregonians have access to this from a physical access standpoint, and really ensuring that, above and beyond the advisory board itself, the state, the advisory board, the governor's office, everyone involved is really ensuring that we're hearing from all walks of life, and that this is really a community effort to create the best program possible. It's not going to be easy. There's going to be disagreements. There's going to be debates. There is going to be a lot of hard work to do, and it's absolutely worth doing, and it's our opportunity to seize. And so I couldn't be more excited to continue to do this work with all of you in creating the best, most affordable, equitable program possible here in Oregon. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen here. I'm going to take a 10-second break to drink some water, and then I'm going to dive into Q&A here. So give me just a second, and go ahead, and if you do have questions that were not answered, you can submit them in the Q&A function, and we'll go ahead and use the remainder of our time here to dive into Q&A. Okay. First question, what is the process to become a facilitator / psilocybin therapist? So facilitators, as I said, this is going to be a huge part of the rulemaking period that's going to tackle. I would not be surprised if there was a subcommittee that was created on just facilitation and training requirements. It certainly is such a big area that merits its own attention, and that will be something that I think is going to be top of mind and one of the biggest questions to tackle, to ensure not only that we can meet the demand for what I believe psilocybin services to be here in Oregon, but to also ensure that those facilitators have the proper training to be able to provide these services to the general public as well. Another question from Zawar. How do you define a psilocybin center? I'm asking because traditional office spaces don't seem conducive to psychedelic experiences in comparison to outdoor spaces, et cetera. It's a great question, Zawar. So Measure 109 does not specifically define what the service center needs to look like, which means in general that there could be various different models. I think that we're very likely to see on one end of the spectrum, literally hospitals will probably work to integrate psilocybin therapy into their programs, as will treatment facilities, right? There is a huge advantage to adding psilocybin services to an existing infrastructure. Now, that's going to be easier said than done. I think there's going to be a lot of questions around how you integrate psilocybin services into a treatment facility type model or a hospital model in general. There's a lot of things that those facilities already have up and running that are going to need to be considered in terms of adding psilocybin therapy services to that modality. But in general, I do think that you can expect you know, places in general that may be hospitals to provide these types of services. There is going to be a certain population that wants to be in that type of environment. Now, I know there's a lot of folks on this call that would probably much rather be in a different environment, whether it be outside, whether it be in not a white light type of environment. And I think the other end of the spectrum that we're going to see is going to be much more of a retreat style model, to where not only, you know, are they going to have, you know, maybe a couple of acres, and there could be an outdoor setting of some type. Again, that's going to be determined within the rulemaking period as to exactly what that looks like. But overall, I do envision seeing, you know, some creative freedom in terms of what the psilocybin therapy center can actually look like. And then in the middle, there's probably going to be something that looks similar to a therapist's office, right? There's no crazy bells and whistles. It's the services. It's really focused on the relationship between the facilitator and the client, and just providing the services that they need. So again, I envision a spectrum of models within the service center side of things. Moving on. How do you see this clinical model moving forward with COVID? Do you think that telehealth, virtual appointments, may play a role in this? From Daniel Weiss. Daniel, it's an excellent question, and one that I'm not going to pretend to have the answer to. If I've learned anything over the last year and a half, it's that trying to predict what is going to happen as a result of a pandemic, or, you know, as a result of downtown Portland, you know, and all the unrest there. Like, it's hard to say. But overall, I do think that telehealth will be able to play a vital role within preparation sessions and in terms of integration. Now, again, telehealth is not specifically called out in Measure 109, but I do believe that there are aspects of psilocybin therapy services that can be effectively accomplished through telehealth. And frankly, we may not have the options to do some of those things in person by the time that the rulemaking is done. I certainly hope that's not the case. But again, time will tell. We do have 2 years between now in which we envision these services being offered to the general public. And so time will tell. And a lot of that's going to have to do with the rulemaking as well. A question from Joshua Schwartz. Are you currently advising similar initiatives in other states, or do you have plans to do so? I'd be lying if I didn't tell you that I get about 10 emails a week from folks in other states that are incredibly excited to do something in their own state, whether it be something small in their own jurisdiction, or whether it be straight up replicating Measure 109 or creating a hybrid model of some kind. The short answer is yes, absolutely. If you've been watching the news at all in terms of psilocybin therapy and how it's been popping up in other states, you probably know that Hawaii actually has its first hearing on a psilocybin therapy bill that is in the legislature right now, this Friday. If you are in Hawaii or you have friends in Hawaii, please encourage them to sign up and testify in favor of that. There's a lot of big opportunities going on out there. And I think through the legislative body that they have, there's some real promise that Hawaii could very well jump into the psilocybin therapy scene sooner than some people might expect. There's a bill introduced in Florida. There's things in the works in California. There's a lot of interest in Washington. You know, there's probably not a state in the country where someone's not working on something. The question is, you know, what is your timeline? Who are you working with? Are you pulling together the right stakeholders? Do you have an idea of how to raise money? Have you considered polling your idea for political viability? There's so many questions that you should be asking yourself and the people around you if you are in another state that is considering moving forward with something like this. And so I would very much encourage you to read Measure 109. And in fact, if you have additional questions after this webinar and you have not read the actual text of the measure, I highly encourage that you do so. If you do read the full text, it is 71 pages, but it's not the hardest bill in the world to read. There's some dry stuff in there, but at the end of the day, it's pretty digestible from a general format. And I promise you, you will be in the upper 1 percentile of people who have that level of information. The vast majority of questions that I get every week are the answers are contained within the measure. And so I would highly encourage folks, please, especially before you send me an email, read the text of the measure. There's a lot in there. And then if your questions are still not answered, feel free to reach out. Again, this is a lot of what I'm doing, is helping answer these questions and helping people really get up to speed on what Measure 109 does and what we're doing moving forward in terms of implementation as well. A question from Keith Gilmore. What form will the delivered psilocybin be in? Actual mushrooms, synthetic, or something else? It's a great question, Keith. Under Measure 109, both synthetic and the natural mushroom will be allowed. And in fact, both Tom and Cherie had the foresight to include a provision within Measure 109 that prohibits the Oregon Health Authority from banning the use of the natural product. Again, there's a prohibition on the Oregon Health Authority banning the use of the natural product. That is really a nod to the folks that would really rather prefer to use the natural product, and it's a nod to the historical and indigenous use of psilocybin in its natural form. Again, we would not be here if it were not for the folks that have been doing this within a ceremonial format for thousands of years, right? And we have a lot to owe and to pay, and our respects to pay to them within this process. And we're going to be sure to include and center those voices and those experiences in the rulemaking process as well. Let's see here, some additional questions. Scott Salazar has a question. How do we continue to be involved? Where do we find out the information? It's a great question, Scott. The Oregon Health Authority is the licensing authority for this program. So at the end of the day, they will make the final decisions on all regulations. I encourage you to follow them closely. I believe they have a psilocybin website up now that you can sign up for updates on meetings, public testimony opportunities. There's gonna be a lot of opportunities over the next 2 years to stay involved. Again, if you have an experience that you'd like to share, or you have an expertise that you believe would be valued within the process, even if you're not on the psilocybin advisory board, there's gonna be a lot of opportunities to share those experiences. And so that is basically one of the many different ways in which you can stay involved. Dr. Peter Addy says, which is a great question. So what exactly is the Healing Advocacy Fund going to do? Good question, Dr. Addy. Thanks for asking. Again, our focus is to ensure that this program is the most affordable, accessible, equitable program possible. So what does that mean? That means that the Healing Advocacy Fund acts as a resource to the Oregon Health Authority, to the governor's office, to other state, federal, or other federal entities, right? And also helping organize a lot of the community members that we need to be a part of this process, especially some of the ones that are not necessarily going to be on the psilocybin advisory board, but that have an experience that they need to share. Again, centering and elevating BIPOC individuals and communities in this conversation is going to be incredibly important to literally put our money where our mouth is in terms of creating an equitable program. That is easier said than done. There's a lot of education to be done over the next 2 years, and there is a ton of organizing as well to continue to justify the need for these services and to ensure that if for whatever reason during the implementation process things fall off the tracks a little bit, the Healing Advocacy Fund will be there to help put them back on and to ensure that, again, the implementation process is going in the right direction to protect the spirit and the intent in which Measure 109 was passed by Oregon voters. Let's see here. All right. Question from Angel. Has there been any discussion about supply chain, quality assurance, and testing psilocybin use in therapeutic settings? It's a great question. I'm sure that is absolutely going to be part of the rulemaking process, Angel. I know that there's a lot of questions about creating, basically a registry that would simultaneously protect patient data while also being a hub in which data could be collected with the permission of the participants to be able to continue to drive the research, right? Oregon has a huge opportunity to be a research leader throughout the country. And I think that there's a lot of interested partners at different universities throughout the state that are super interested in expanding on the existing research today. And I think Oregon has a huge opportunity to do that. And one of the ways in which we can do that is ensuring that we have a program that, includes, a robust supply chain and quality assurance and testing. Again, the patient safety is top of mind with this program, and we really need to make sure that we've got all of our I's dotted and our T's crossed when it comes to those type of things. All right. A question from Callie. Do you foresee the problem arising of someone trying to leave the facility in the middle of the therapy? Yes. That is exactly why the facilitator must certify the completion of the psilocybin therapy session. No one is going to be driving home under the influence of psilocybin. And so that is something that we're going to be diving into from a policy standpoint and from a regulation standpoint over the next 2 years. All right. Question from Joe Izzo. As you're creating the rules for all of this, does it leave room for microdosing to be included? Is there a give and take in the rule creating process, or is it just as written? Great question, Joe. So for the first question, will microdosing be included? So Measure 109 is silent on microdosing. The structure in which it was created is certainly focused on larger dose, full flood dose psilocybin therapy sessions. And so the program is not really designed for microdosing, but it doesn't prohibit microdosing. So I'm sure that's going to be a point of conversation during the rulemaking process, especially with a lot of the research and discussion around microdosing in general going on throughout society and kind of across the country right now. It's certainly a hot topic, and I'd be really surprised if it wasn't one that the advisory board worked to dive into to some degree, but time will tell during the rulemaking process. A great question from Rose Goodwin. Will insurance cover psilocybin therapy? I do not know. At the end of the day, whether or not insurance will cover this therapy is an incredibly important question. And it's going to be one that really requires the insurance companies to be part of this conversation, right? Creating affordable access, again, is easier said than done. It not only requires, but insurance companies to be involved in the conversation. It requires the state. It requires other nonprofits. There are funds being put together just to support BIPOC communities having access to this type of program, right? And so it's going to be incredibly important that we are having all these stakeholders at the table. There's no silver bullet answer in terms of how we're going to make this program affordable. It's really going to take all stakeholders coming together to figure out the multitude of different ways, from allowing group therapy, right, to lower the cost, from subsidized access to sliding scales to potentially certain licensing fees being set aside for those who otherwise would not be able to financially afford access to services or licensing, right? There's a whole lot of new ideas that are being developed inside and outside of Oregon right now that are really going to make up the larger conversation of what does affordable access actually look like, and how can we make that access a reality here in Oregon during the 2-year implementation process. So a lot of work to do within that process over the next 2 years in terms of insurance and affordability. Okay, give me just a second here. Okay, lots of questions about ways to be involved if you're not on the board. Again, just because you're not going to be on the psilocybin advisory board does not mean you will not have an opportunity to provide public comment and be involved in the discourse within that public comment period. I think that there's going to be a lot of opportunities at the Oregon Health Authority and the psilocybin advisory board, and possibly the subcommittees as well, doing a call for information from folks, whether that be people who are involved with studies or people that have a certain shared experience that's incredibly unique, that would be incredibly important to the rulemaking process. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for people to play a part in that conversation during the rulemaking process. So again, stay tuned. The psilocybin advisory board has not yet been announced. Once it is, I'm sure there's a lot more information that the Oregon Health Authority is going to release on that front. And so stay tuned. Again, the Oregon Health Authority website should be able to provide some initial information, but again, we're just really getting started. The dust on the campaign is just settling. And we've got a lot that we're moving into over the next couple of months here in terms of rulemaking. So stay tuned. I'm sure the Oregon Health Authority, as well as the Healing Advocacy Fund and other groups that are emerging as well, will have a lot of opportunities to get involved once the ball gets rolling on those meetings. All right. So a good question around some of the opposition that we found during the campaign, specifically folks from more of the traditional healthcare community opposing the measure and wondering what is the most effective way to counter opposition. It's a great question. In my mind, I believe that the best way to counter opposition is to help people understand that in order to create equitable access, we really have to strike the right balance between regulations and safety and protocols and ensuring that those regulations are not overly burdensome to where they create higher barriers of entry for people who otherwise probably traditionally don't have access to regular healthcare, right? And so again, that's why it's so important. We at the Healing Advocacy Fund are going to be working incredibly closely with BIPOC communities throughout the state. We have so many coalition partners that helped us get here, and we're going to call on them once again to help us create the most affordable, equitable program possible. And again, their contribution to this effort will not go unrecognized. It will be compensated. And so we're really going to literally put our money where our mouth is in terms of, creating the most equitable program possible and working with our BIPOC community coalition partners throughout the state and some around the country as well, and really putting together the best policies possible when it comes to equitable access. So I really think that the best offense and defense in terms of implementation is really looking at this entire process through an equity lens. And I think that if we're not able to do that, well, we have to. We really have no choice. Let's see here. So many questions. I'm trying to get to a couple here. Dan Gullitz says, will you be doing more updates as the process proceeds? For sure. The one thing I need to mention is that I am the executive director of the Healing Advocacy Fund and the only staff member. So I have limited capacity in general, so I won't be doing as many updates as I'd like to, but we're certainly going to continue to do email updates. I'll probably do more webinar updates like this, and we'll probably have some educational panels as well. Again, there's a lot of people that we're working with that have experience in crafting equitable policy, and we're going to need their help. And I think it's going to be incredibly important that we create access to those people as well, right? We're not the only ones asking these questions here in Oregon. People are asking these questions across the country and around the world. And it really is important that we involve the entire community in these conversations. Okay. Got time for maybe 2 more questions here. I know there's a lot of messages in the chat I have not looked at just yet. Okay, question from Ryan Reed. Will the Oregon Health Authority have the capacity to issue early R&D variances within the next 2 years to support their rulemaking with data? That's an excellent question. And I don't know. It's a good question for rulemaking. I can't think that we're going to be issuing licenses any faster than the beginning of 2023. That alone might be a tight timeline. Again, we have a lot of work to do, but again, I'm really excited to learn more about the folks that are going to be appointed to the Psilocybin Advisory Board and to work with them to expedite the timeline to the extent that we can. But again, we're tackling some pretty big questions in terms of ensuring that facilitators have the proper amount of training and that this program is affordable and accessible. Again, it may sound like a broken record at this point, but that's really the name of the game. And if we can't create that type of program with that type of equitable access, we did this for nothing. And I believe that we did this for the people who are suffering, that stand to benefit from having access. And there's so many of them. And so at the end of the day, again, there's a lot of work that we have to do during the rulemaking period of the next 2 years. A good question from Armand. Do you know that we appreciate you, Sam? Are you taking good care of yourself? Thank you, Armand. I appreciate the love. I am doing very well. I feel, incredibly privileged and lucky and humbled to continue to play a small role in the rollout of this program. On top of the fact that, I have a roof over my head. I have power at my house. I live in a house and I'm generally healthy. Again, those are a lot of those things many people right now cannot say. And so I want to continue to leverage the capacity that I have to making this program the best thing possible. And again, I feel I'm just incredibly lucky and humbled to have the role as the executive director of a nonprofit to do this work. It's what I love doing. I love helping people. I love working on drug policy reform, and I couldn't envision a better thing that I could be doing with my time. So I'm just very grateful to have this opportunity to continue to work with folks. And yeah, just very excited. Final question here, and I know that I've only answered about 10 or 15 of your questions of the total of 42 that are currently existing in the Q&A section. Again, apologies if I didn't get to your question yet. I will be reviewing them and considering a bunch of those questions for future webinars for sure. You can email me directly at sam@healingadvocacyfund.org. Again, please be patient with me in responding. If I don't respond, it's either because I just have been buried in email, or it also possibly because if you have a question that is answered either from reading our website or reading the measure, I typically give people a little bit more time to do some of their homework and getting familiar with the measure before I respond to all of those. I get about 50 inquiries a week from folks asking questions about the measure. So I just kindly ask that just do a little bit of your diligence. If you haven't read the measure, please do so. It's incredibly informative. And I think there's a lot of folks out there that are asking really good questions, and a lot of the answers are contained in the measure itself. And so, yeah, definitely check that out. And last but not least, question from Carl says, the Healing Advocacy Fund is a nonprofit. Is there a way to donate? Yes, Carl, it is somewhat ironic and unfortunate that we are a nonprofit with the word fund in our name, yet I have yet to get our donation link up on our website. Hopefully it's going to be up by the end of the week. In the meantime, feel free to email me. You can also send us a check. You can make it out to the Healing Advocacy Fund overall, and we can handle things that way. But again, feel free to email me. Probably put funder in the subject line. I'll get to you as quickly as I can. But again, sam@healingadvocacyfund.org. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. Again, thank you, everyone who attended. My apologies if I didn't get to your question. I'm not avoiding any questions. There's just a lot of them and a lot of folks asking a lot of good questions. And again, the next time we do this, it will probably be more of a panel format. I will do a lot less talking because there's a lot more interesting people than me that I think you want to hear from. And we're going to do a lot of good work over the next 2 years. So again, stay tuned. If you also go to healingadvocacyfund.org on our contact page, there's also a place where you can sign up for our e-newsletter. I encourage you to do that. Again, we'll be sending periodic updates as things happen. And stay tuned for the Psilocybin Advisory Board to be announced by the end of this month. Again, really excited, really humbled to continue to be able to do this work with all of you. We've got our work cut out for us. But again, I'm incredibly excited and dedicated to create the most affordable, accessible, equitable psilocybin therapy program possible here in Oregon. So again, thank you everyone for your time and your effort. I'm really looking forward to talking with all of you over the next weeks, months, and years to come in creating this program. So with that, I'll talk to you all soon. Thank you again so much. We will be posting this recording sometime by the end of this week, hopefully, if not early next week. And you can feel free to share that with friends, rewatch it, whatever you want to do with it. So again, thank you everyone so much. We'll talk to you soon. Have a good night.